Hello and welcome to the Oral History Project. We are at ASC in Chicago on November 15th, 2012, and we are pleased to have a conversation with Dr. Daniel Nagin. Just to give a little background on Dr. Nagin, he did his undergrad and graduate work at Carnegie Mellon, and he's now currently a university professor at Carnegie Mellon. He's had a very long career, started out as assistant professor at Duke University. You are now University Professor at Carnegie Mellon, the Associate Dean of Faculty at Carnegie Mellon, served as a visiting professor at the University of Cambridge at the Russell Sage Foundation, served as a Deputy Secretary for Fiscal Policy and Analysis for the Pennsylvania Department of Revenue, and are a member of the MacArthur Network. You have been awarded with many accolades. In 2006, you were awarded with the ASC's Edwin Sutherland Award. You were named a life member of the Clare Hall College of the University of Cambridge. You have been elected a Fellow of ASC and the American Society for the Advancement of Sciences. Looking over your vita, I've seen that you've been awarded over $3.5 million in grants, and 20 of them. You have over 120 journal articles published, over 20 book chapters published, and 4 books and
including one with
reports,
you,
including one with me. I was going to say. So it's a little background. You've had a very long and illustrious career. You don't look like you're stopping at any time soon. You look like you're being very active. But can we go back a little bit and tell me how you became a criminologist? What sparked your interest?
Well, actually, I more stumbled into it. When I went back to graduate school, that is to get my PhD, I thought that I was going to do something related to health economics. But one day I walked into Al Bloomstein's office and said, Al, this was in the mid-'70s, when crime rates were just starting to really climb, and I said, how much of the crime increase is due to age, the baby boom coming through? He said, I don't know, let's study it. And then the rest is history. That's how I got involved. And so we wrote a paper about that, which was not a very good paper. No, it really wasn't. Interestingly, one of my persons who was actually on my dissertation committee, who remains a close friend and collaborator, but he was an assistant professor at the time, named Chuck Mansky, said I shouldn't include that paper on my vita. but following that, I got interested in deterrence, and that wound up kind of sealing the deal. Al and I wrote a grant to the NIJ to study deterrence, and which led to which was I was funded, and a nice thing about that was that my days as living on a graduate student stipend were relatively short. Within 2 years that we had the grant, but that formed the foundation for my dissertation, and the rest is history, I guess.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Is there anything besides your formal education and your work with Al Bloomstein that led to your interest in crime rates and deterrence? Anything in your biographical history, or
no, not actually.
Where you grew up, or
actually not. No, it was. My only real experience with crime was being robbed in the subway. I lived in New York, which has turned out, the silver lining of all that was that ever since then I get promptly excused from jury duty for being a victim of a violent crime. And so that's that. So as I recall, it cost me like $30 or $40. So it was a little scary to have a gun in your face, but there was something from it.
$30 to $40, but never having jury duty. Right. It's kind of a good payoff. So, okay, now we know how you became a criminologist. If you look through your vita, you can see about 3 major categories of your work. You can see crime and sanctions, and that's where a lot of your deterrence work comes from. A lot of the work that you and I have kind of worked on with imprisonment and recidivism. And then you look at the developmental origins of criminal behavior, and then you have group-based trajectories.
Right.
Can you explain how you explained a little bit how you fell into the deterrence topic by talking to Al Bloomstein in the 70s. But can you tell me how you got interested in those other areas of work?
Yeah, up until probably it's hard to put a time frame, mid to early, late not 80s. I was working a lot on deterrence questions, and and I was doing a lot of that work with Ray Paternoster, and that was also the time when the Gottfredson-Hershey book came out, and it got me thinking about the whole issue of enduring individual differences. And in the work I did with Ray, we were looking at interactions between deterrent effects and different measures of self-control and so forth. Then I got interested in the question of why it was that criminal behavior or delinquent behavior was so enduring, and it wasn't obvious to me why that should be the case, and in particular, and this is drawing connection with a different body of work. At that time, Jim Heckman, the economist at the University of Chicago, wrote a very influential paper, which actually appeared in a volume that I wrote, where I had a paper which was not nearly so good, in which he described two generic explanations for why, if you see behavior, whether it's criminal or any kind of behavior, being repeated over time, what the explanations for that were. And one was what he called persistent heterogeneity, which is what, let's say in the context of criminology, Gottfredson-Hershey would in this context, for example, call poor self-control. But the other explanation was that these kinds of behaviors were reinforcing, which was called state dependence, and so that what, for example, Rob and John would call snowballing effects. I mean, where the behavior, for example, you engage in delinquency, you might get labeled in the criminal justice system, and then that reinforces that behavior and so forth. So that there's a cause and effect relationship going on, as opposed to simply you're being a persistently bad actor and nothing is gonna in any way deflect your behavior. And so I was really impressed by that paper, and so Ray and I wrote a paper about that appeared in Criminology, I think, in either about 1990, where we offered the state dependence versus heterogeneity interpretation of persistent behavior, and I think that, unfortunately, I think that the paper may have been forgotten. I'm not sure, but I think it wound up being very influential paper. And I have to say that Doug Smith was the editor of Criminology at the time, and when he wrote us our letter of acceptance, he told Ray and I that he thought it was the best paper that had been published during his tenure as an editor. So that was very gratifying. So that's how I got interested in the question in life coursework, by trying to understand what were the developmental origins of criminal and violent behavior.
Wonderful. Of all the work that you've done, all your 120 articles and 25 book chapters and multiple books, what do you look at with the most pride? Which contributions do you have the most pride about?
It's a good question. I suppose the work that I just described and the trajectory modeling work. I suppose are maybe the most innovative. But on the other hand, I think that I also take a lot of pride in the work that you and I did with Frank, and the work I've done on deterrence reviews, both going back to 1978 when I was the staff on the staff director for the volume called Deterrence and Incapacitation, and then most recently the work that I was chaired in an NRC committee on the deterrent effect of capital punishment. And I take a lot of pride in that work. Now that's more synthetic. It's different, but I take, so it's of a different nature than the other work. But I take a lot of pride and satisfaction out of the work we did together.
Mm-hmm.
So
absolutely. Of all the things that you're working on currently, what are you most excited about?
The work that again it's related to the crime and justice review we did, but in trying to understand how I step back is I wrote a paper in 2009 with Stephen Durloff, an economist, which appeared in Crime and Justice, and it's called Imprisonment and Crime: How to Reduce Both. And that is my current passion is to speak out loudly about the fact that I think that our American criminal justice policy is just badly out of disjoint, and in making the case that there's just no evidence for the effectiveness of long prison sentences, both either they're not effective deterrents, they make no sense from a perspective of incapacitation. It doesn't make any sense to be incarcerating aged criminals, and I think in most instances it's just very hard to make a case that the person is receiving their just desert. And it's gratifying. I'm not because of my own influence, but I think the tide is changing in the United States finally. And I think related to that is understanding though how better to use the resources of the criminal justice system to prevent crime.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And a lot of your work from the Netherlands have been showing this. I mean, they have fantastic data. So looking back on your career, what would you say your identifying characteristics are? Or what do you think you are most well known for?
Those are different questions.
Yes.
I suspect, it's hard for me to judge. I suspect I'm
or what would you like them to be?
Well, I suspect I'm best known for the work on trajectory modeling. I would think, and maybe deterrence, but I think that's the case. As for how the work is perceived and so forth, that I can't judge. What I try to do, I like to think that I'm a careful scholar who carefully does things and tries to clearly explain what they mean and what they don't mean, and so forth, not overstepping what you're doing, and trying to do things in as rigorous a fashion as possible.
And being a co-author of yours, I can say you are doing quite well in that area. Tell me about how your mentees, because you have been a mentor, you've chaired many dissertations, how have your mentees influenced your own research agenda?
That's an interesting question. In some cases, they wound up sort of bringing me into studying a whole area that I'd never even been involved with. In the case of Lero Dugan, she did her dissertation on domestic violence and intimate partner homicide, and that was not an area that I didn't have worked on at all. And because this was done during the period of time when the National Consortium on Violence Research was up and going, Rick Rosenfeld was also involved, which was an interest. That was a sort of interesting collaboration with Rick and Laura. So that was a case where the work, brought me into a whole area that I hadn't been involved with. And actually, in the same way, I've been involved with also a lot of mentees who were psychologists doing it in Montreal. They were associated with Richard Tremblay, and that kind of brought me into thinking about how, in this case, people who study psychopathology and developmental psychology, there's an overlap in their interests with criminology, but it's different in ways that are, well, in the course of this interview, are hard to describe. And so these kinds of relationships influence you learn from the people you work with, including your students, and in subtle ways they change the way you think about things, and as Einstein said, God is in the details, and so the way your students influence you, and they genuinely influence you just in working with them, and if they're smart and hardworking students, which I like to work with, is they in different ways nudge you in thinking about things in a different way, and I think in the end wind up giving you a much richer perspective on things.
Absolutely. Now on the flip side of that, if you could give advice to young scholars, because many people who watch these videos may be watching them in a criminology course at a university,
right,
and maybe thinking about going on to graduate school or maybe getting their PhD right now, what advice do you have in modern day criminology right now? What advice do you have for people who are just starting out?
I think that I guess a couple piece of advice is, one thing I think it is important to try to develop a line of research and a set of ideas for which you're known.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you can build careers, and so it's important that you not be too scattered. Mm-hmm. Early on, but on the other hand, you don't want to be too narrow. I mean, so you don't want to be perceived as a one-trick pony.
Right.
And so the question, that there's a subtle balancing act going on. I think it's also important that you be productive, but I think there's an unfortunate trend of people publishing too many little things, and so again there's a balancing act that's required. All research is incremental and builds on the next step, but the aim is to be cumulative. Mm-hmm. And to be able to see how this piece of research, sort of in a material, it doesn't have to be, the most, dramatic thing, but makes a material contribution, makes a real step forward, as opposed to simply putting a new line on your vita.
Right.
And so that, and again, that there's a balancing act that's necessary. There are instances of scholars, and this can be particularly the case in economics, where people write relatively few papers. There are Nobel Prize winners who have maybe 15 or 20 publications on their vita, but those are relatively unusual people. So there is a need for some volume. But to repeat myself, it's important that those be real contributions, not just, as I said, a line on your vita.
I think there's a big push right now that you don't want to say no to anything. If you get invited to an article, as somebody who's coming out recently, I've been out for 3 years, you want to build the vita. I mean, and so it's nice to hear. It's almost like you're saying that the quality over the quantity. You still need to have that volume, but make sure that the quality pieces.
Yeah, I do think that it's. When I look back at my own work, I think that if I think about the work that I take the most pride in, there's exceptions to this, but most of it, the things that I take most pride in, came after I got tenure, and it was just liberating. I didn't have to worry. And I think the volume kept up, but I didn't feel any pressure. Particular pressure, to publish. It was just and to focus on quality. So now that I'm sort of more unfortunately towards the end of the career, when you did the introduction, I felt like you should stuff me and put me on the wall. Is that basic? I generally will not do anything. I will not write a paper unless I think I can make a contribution. time is too short.
I get that feeling from Frank Cohen very often. Now, what are your general thoughts on the field? Like, where do you think the field is going? Where do you think it should go?
Where's it going? I certainly I think that the move towards life course criminology has been an important one. What do I think it should be doing? I think criminology in general should be more attentive to some of the work that's going on in econometrics and statistics about causal inference. I think there's an awful lot of really, frankly, sloppy work and claims that are made in that regard. And there are usable approaches and methods that are available that are not being used. I think there's too much thinking of if you put enough variables in a regression that somehow that's going to make something provide a causal interpretation to results, and that's kind of a level of thinking that was going on in the 70s and 80s, and there are things they're controversial. Some of these things there's people with strong points of view about what approach is about the value of things like propensity score matching and so forth. But it's important to recognize that those debates in econometrics and statistics, there's universal agreement that just throwing it all into a regression is not going to solve the problem. So I think criminologists need to be more sensitive to that. Another thing that's happening, which I think is a good move, but we need to, as a discipline, think more carefully about what it means. I think that this move towards evidence-based policy is a healthy one. Not only of looking for evidence, but the policy part of it, of criminologists thinking about what are the policy implications of the work that you're doing, and learning how, in doing that, to think about what is policy relevant and how it should be presented and so forth. And I think that interesting part of that is one thing about criminology being sort of an outside, coming in from the outside, that's always puzzled me, is this disjuncture between criminology and like the American Criminology Society versus ACG, the ACG. I can't even remember the acronym. People who are interested in criminal justice systems.
Yep.
And that group is sort of considered to be practitioner types, and I detect a sneering attitude about it. But that's where all the policy action is. Not all, but there's a lot of important policy issues there, and we've been studying them and bringing those issues and turning them into and reframing them as questions of public policy, of science. I think would be a very healthy direction for criminology to go, to think about the functioning of the criminal justice system and how it affects crime and what it can be do to reduce it. I don't know why this is the case. It may have something to do with criminology's roots in sociology, but for whatever the reason is, I think that's starting to change, and it should change.
Now, you mentioned when you said with the future directions that you would like to see a lot more collaboration with the econometrics and the statistics. Do you have any ideas how to kind of foster that collaboration? How you could, because you've done it quite well.
Right. Well, I think that I think the way it is happening, and I think it's happening with sort of a newer generation of criminologists, who are learning these methods. I mean, it's now standard practice for students at the Maryland Criminology Department to go take courses in the Maryland Economics Department. The economics courses, and I know that's happening elsewhere as well. And so by having the newest generation of students come in and in various ways begin honing their technical skills, and I think that's going to change it. I think that there's also it's a trickle, but a flow of students from the kind of backgrounds that I'm from entering criminology as well, and that they tend to also have these kinds of skills. I mean, I was speaking with Frank Cullen this day about a person that they're recruiting, that Cincinnati is recruiting, who's from the Berkeley Public Policy School, and that's an example of a kind of person that will also bring these skills into criminology.
Absolutely. And then to follow up too on, you said that we need, you agree that the field should be more policy oriented. How do you think we should get our information out? Because right now in our normal outlets, we're publishing in journals, and in reality, a lot of it's other academics reading these journals. It's not the policymakers, it's not the practitioners. How do you think we should change how we publish and disseminate our information so the actual practitioners and policymakers are getting their hands on this research?
That's a good question, which I don't have an answer to that, but I would say the following is the first thing that has to happen is that criminologists have to be able to intelligently discuss the policy implications of their research in their own articles. Again, I was having a discussion with Tom Blumberg, who's the current editor of Criminology and Public Policy, and Bill Bales and I are taking over from him. And he indicated that one of the hardest things as editor, that he has to get people to do is to talk intelligently and in any depth about the policy implications. So that's where it has to begin. After that happens, the raw material will be there for things to happen, to influence policy. And how that happens is very dependent upon personalities. What I mean by that is there are certain kinds of people who probably would be the great majority of criminologists, even those who are doing good policy work, who aren't interested. It's just not the kind of thing they want to do. People have different strengths, but then there are other people out there who, in different ways, are interested in influencing the policy process in different ways. So there are people like Larry Sherman, who's very obviously proactive about his wanting to do that. But then there are also people like Frank Cullen, who's he's a very different personality than Larry, but also is very interested in affecting policy, not the way that Larry does it, but by putting together volumes and so forth, and in his own writing in a way that people who affect policy can understand. So I think we have to understand that there are different styles of doing this, and it's not something like you can have a cookie cutter approach, to doing it.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, I think those are all the questions that I have for you today. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate having you here.